Hi. Okay, so, really quickly. Blah blah, blah blah blah. Thanks, Gemini. So, basically, in RPGs, you do quests, slay monsters, gain levels, get better equipment, rinse and repeat. I'm being very careful about not mixing things up with roguelites, which was a very popular, if vague, term in the late 80s and early 90s, thanks to the legacy of this game, Rogue. Many other RPGs of the same era got lumped into the same category. A more modern 2008 interpretation of roguelikes called the Berlin interpretation highlights a very crucial difference for our purposes, namely this button, right here. According to the Berlin interpretation, one defining factor of modern roguelikes is a concept called permadeath, meaning that if you happen to die during your run, your character is wiped out and you have to begin a new game. Saving a game in roguelikes is usually just the temporary suspension of your current run, and not a feature that provides you with limitless recovery. Not with our 3 games this time around though. All of them have a regular save game feature that allows us to load our progress. Otherwise, this video probably wouldn't exist, as I'd still be trying to complete these games. Also, unlike many examples of older RPGs, all of our games this time have a nice graphical interface that allows for a degree of mouse control instead of being text-based. All of these games also feature a built-in help function, something that sounds really basic, but was actually a luxury that was only occasionally offered. They're also all turn-based, as is very common for these kind of games from the same era. Look, they're all quite similar in many ways, is what I'm saying. But there are differences, and that's what we are here to talk about. The 3 games I'm gonna be talking about are Castle of the Winds, Lords of Doom, and Ragnarok. And I'm gonna be talking about all 3 at the same time. This video will be long, and the structure probably won't make any sense. Let's talk about the simplest one first, and end with arguably the most complex one. Castle of the Winds, also known as Castle of the Winds, Part 1, A Question of Vengeance, was made by Rick Saga in 1989. That title is metal as heck. This game is one of the rare examples of these types of RPGs that I was able to beat as a kid. It comes down to a combination of factors, all of which highlight the simple, streamlined nature of Castle of the Winds. I'm gonna talk about that in a bit. The initial setup for the game is that more raiders have pillaged the farm you were raised in and killed your grandparents. The bandits took the amulet that was given by your mortally wounded true father to your grandparents for safekeeping. According to your grandfather, the amulet would lead you to fortune and glory, but only if you could prove your worth. You grimly vow that nothing will prevent you from avenging their deaths. Essentially, what happens next is that you go on a murderous rampage in monster-infested dungeons to exterminate every single living and unliving being unfortunate enough to cross your path, until the trail of mangled corpses finally leads you back to your father's amulet. The best thing about Castle of the Winds for me has always been the combination of simplicity, accessibility, and good UX. Let's take a look at all 3 games and talk about user interfaces for a second. In Ragnarok, the UI is divided into a roughly 2x2 grid. The bottom left area is your main view, along with a status screen. The bottom right contains a bunch of action buttons. The top half is entirely dedicated to a giant minimap of the current area. There's also a very tiny excuse for an action log at the bottom of the screen that can only fit a few lines of text. While sort of functional, the tiny main screen is a constant bother. Ranged weapons feel kind of pointless when the visible enemies are only a few squares away at maximum. There are also no tooltips. You'll have to constantly check the command list to figure out what the action buttons do. You have separate views for managing your backpack and worn items. The UI feels cramped overall, with an unnecessarily large minimap and a tiny main view that's so crushed between other UI elements that it almost feels like an afterthought. The UI is seemingly trying to do as much as it can, all at once, so that the user wouldn't have to switch screens. As for Lods of Doom, oh boy. It's another 2x2 grid, but the upper half is slightly taller than the bottom half. The upper left area is your main view. For some reason that I can't fathom, the upper right area is entirely dedicated to your inventory, making it constantly visible. Despite how prominently it's displayed, I did not find myself needing to mess with my equipment all that much. The lower left area is the action log, while the lower right area is divided into status screens and a few menu buttons. Again, the main view feels too small next to the giant inventory view. In combat, the inventory view hides your backpack and adds some combat-related buttons, whereas during conversations with NPCs, the action log takes over. I will give props for the damage indicators during combat. They're much more intuitive than having to constantly watch the action log. The UI has the reverse of Ragnarok's issues. There's a ton of wasted space, giant icons, and unnecessary active views. I found myself missing the extravagant minimap from Ragnarok. In Castle of the Winds, the UI consists of a large main view that follows your character around, a few toolbars at the top, and an action log and a status display at the bottom. The native Windows 3.1 UI framework does a lot of the heavy lifting. Pressing C will bring up an Edit Character window, although the only things you can edit are your name and character icon. It would have been super helpful to have your armor class and whatnot displayed in your inventory screen also, because figuring out what kind of impact an item might have on your armor value is largely guesswork, and it's annoying to have to keep jumping to the stats screen. Pressing M will bring up your map, which nicely lays out the current area. If you're in a dungeon, it will only display the currently explored areas. Pressing I will bring up your inventory, which consists of a series of smaller windows for the floor, your backpack, belt, purse, etc. It operates on a drag and drop principle, which is very intuitive to use compared to the other games here. Except for the shield slot. I must have completed half of the game before I realized that you need to equip your shield in the dedicated slot instead of your, free hand. I guess you strap the shields across your chest or something in this world. In fact, equipping a weapon in your free hand does nothing. You still attack only with your weapon hand. Your free hand is effectively just an extra slot to hold some of the heavy stuff, like a suit of armor, or to activate stuff like spellbooks. Right-clicking on anything will display a small tooltip with a description of what you're looking at. It seems like such a trivial detail, but tooltips like these were a rarity at the time. There's a bunch of buttons, drop-downs and menus in the toolbars at the top, all of which are relatively self-explanatory. The only information that isn't readily available is stuff like how much damage a weapon does, or how much defense a suit of armor has, or what kind of impact a magic item has on your stats, stuff like that. You have to go into the help docs to try and figure that stuff out. And even then you're only left with a vague idea at best. A good UI is invisible. You know what most buttons and menus do intuitively, without having to consult some kind of command list or separate document to know. All of the focus is on the large main area and in the action itself. And that's what Castle of the Winds does well. Most RPGs let you create your own character, or at least customize some aspects of him or her or it, right? So, okay, let's talk about customization and character creation. I'd say the worst example here is Ragnarok. You get to choose your name, sex, and character class. That's it. Nothing fancy. Characters begin with different sets of stats and starting items, but that's largely it. I'm not saying the classes aren't interesting themselves. I mean, how often do you get to play as a blacksmith?
Let's roll the dice!
You get to switch classes every 10 levels though, and at class level 9 you're able to master the class-specific skill. So actual progression feels much more relevant in Ragnarok. Lods of Doom, on the surface at least, seems to offer the most options for your character. That is, until you realize that the impact of your choices ends up feeling largely trivial. You get to pick 2 points for 2 different stats, and 2 points for 2 different skills. If that feels like a very limited amount of character points, that's because it is. None of the attributes or skills have any descriptions, so you don't really know how they affect your character anyway. It's just another thing to look up in the manual. You also get to choose your face, name, and handedness, which I don't think I've seen in any other game because it's another very arbitrary choice that doesn't really affect the game. As such, I think that the character creation of Castle of the Winds has the most actual impact on the game. You can distribute a total of 230 points between 4 different attributes, with a minimum of 20 points and a maximum of 72 points per attribute. You don't actually get to see the point values as they're represented by these bars, so you basically have to count your clicks or eyeball the segments. Again, even the help docs don't actually tell you, in concrete terms, how the character attributes affect gameplay, so you'd need to look those up in the wiki. What about sounds and music, then? Lods of Doom, for example, has only music, composed by Michal Zik. It has no sound effects at all. The music isn't bad, but it does start to feel a tad repetitive as there's only one track per area. The combat music is always the same. It's interesting in a sense because I don't remember playing many old RPGs that had music. It does require a Gravis ultrasound though, so emulating that in-game took a fair bit of investigation and experimentation. There's even a utility feature in the setup program that allows you to extract all of the tracks as MIDI files. Apparently, the original Ragnarok had only very basic sound effects, but Valhalla should have music and sound effects. Well, I can't say I encountered any music, at least at the start of the game. More like short sound effects and slightly longer ones, but look, the sound effects are pretty loud and jarring. What's worse, the game execution gets paused for as long as a sound effect is playing. That's kind of a problem when you die and there's this bell sound that just seems to loop indefinitely. Meaning you're stuck at the game over screen until you restart the whole game. Castle of the Winds has no sound or music, like many other simulator games from the same era. I think I honestly like it better, since I mostly played Lords of Doom and Ragnarok with sounds off too. It's one of those games that encourages you to listen to other music. Or if you're like me, you'll have YouTube making noise in the background. You see, I don't think having sound and music adds much to these kind of games, especially since they're turn-based. I think the games would need flashier animations for sound effects to start making sense, and I'd much rather have ambient environmental tracks instead of actual music. Part 1 is the shareware version of Castle of the Winds. Part 2, Liftranzir's Bane, is, or was, the commercial release. It effectively contains a new town called Crossroads, and a new dungeon, the titular Castle of the Winds. It's more of the same, really, so I won't focus on it too much. I also obviously had no access to it as a kid. One interesting aspect of Part 2 is that you can actually load your completed save from Part 1 and continue with the same character. Nowadays, both parts are freeware, and you should definitely try the game out. It's a very simple but accessible game, and you can finish the first part in an evening. Next up on the agenda is Lords of Doom. No, not that one. This one. Lords of Doom, also known as Lords of Doom, Part 1, The Black God, was made by Bartek Zik in 1995. There was never a Part 2. I must have stumbled across this game either in one of those game collection CDs, or maybe I downloaded it off a gaming magazine website. This game is obscure, it's different, and I'm so glad I found it so I could play it again. The manual sums up the game concisely. The purpose of the game is to lead a lone hero to defeat a powerful evil demigod, awakened by the Great Comet. I'm gonna add to that in a bit. I should also mention at this point that the manual in question and the game itself are riddled with typos, and I suspect that the creator wasn't a native English speaker. Neither am I, and in my opinion, they just add to the charm, and don't really prevent you from enjoying the game. The thing I like most about Lords of Doom is the story. You know, the central feature of most RPGs. That may sound a bit surprising, but compared to the other two games here, they barely have any story. The story of Castle of the Winds is largely set up in the help docs. You get a few windows worth of story development during the game, but that's about it. I think I counted around 10 of those in total. But even that is far more than you'll ever get in Ragnarok. Most of the story is told through the manual. There's very little in the game itself that tells you how the narrative is progressing. You largely have to rely on your own imagination for that. The story in Lords of Doom, on the other hand, is very nicely explained in the game itself. You don't need to consult the manual to piece together the narrative, even though there is some interesting stuff in there. For example, there's a personal anecdote by the developer about the comet Hyakutake, which was passing near Earth at the time of the game's second release in 1996. Considering that the game's story prominently involves a comet, the developer remarked, "It seems some magic still remains in our world." The initial exposition is given in the game's intro sequence, which establishes stuff like the game's primary antagonist and the player's main motivation. The Great Comet arrives and wakes up the evil demigod Zerigoth, who will ascend into true godhood in 9 days, unless something is done. The capital has fallen, the king is dead, and your hometown has been conquered. You return from your travels to find your master mortally wounded, and with his last remaining strength, he teleports you to the steppes of Nar, where you begin your last-ditch attempt to save the world. There's an item in the game called the Book of Hossaur that acts as a repository of lore that you can peruse at your leisure once you find it. The manual says it has over 60 pages, but I don't remember it being that long. The game does rely heavily on the player consulting this book, however, and I think you can pretty easily softlock your game if you ignore its advice. There are also a few notes that can be discovered during the game that add a bit of narrative flavor. Most importantly, you can actually interact with other characters during the game, and they really flesh out the world. Some of them are merchants, with whom you can buy and sell equipment. Others can give you information about the area and the current situation, and sometimes provide extremely important clues on what to do next. There are even a few choices you can make in conversations that affect the game. In Ragnarok and Castle of the Winds, you gain experience by defeating enemies. The more baddies you pound into the ground, the more levels you gain, and the stronger your character becomes. Compared to modern RPGs, there is no quest system in place in any of these games, and there aren't any extra activities that you can undergo to gain some more exp. In Lords of Doom, the character progression is completely obtuse and bizarre. I found out very quickly that fighting monsters wasn't getting me anything. No experience, no gold, no other rewards. I had to check the manual regarding this, and it states, "You are getting experience points for exploring the area, talking with NPCs, and solving different problems." Whatever the hell that means. I found out that seemingly arbitrary intervals that my health and or mana had gone up a little. The game doesn't announce your character progression in any way, so it just kinda happens in the background. Speaking of progression, in most RPGs you start off as a weak, inexperienced nobody that will surrender to a stiff breeze. In Lords of Doom, you basically start off as a seasoned adventurer who has traveled the world and studied magic for years. It's an interesting twist where most enemy encounters throughout the game won't be much of a problem for you individually. It's the gradual attrition that you take over multiple battles that's the main threat to your survival. Speaking of survival, let's take a look at vital resource management for a moment. Health is your primary resource in all of these games. If it ever drops to 0 or less, it's game over. Castle of the Winds is the simplest case here. You've got health, and mana. Those are the only things you need to keep track of. If your mana falls to 0, you can still survive, but your options will be a lot more limited. You can't teleport away, you can't heal yourself, and you can't shoot magic projectiles at your enemies, that sort of stuff. In Ragnarok, you've got hit points, magic points, and a hunger meter. Only the Conjurer seems to have any use for magic points as far as I can tell, since that's the only class that can cast spells. If your hunger meter drops low enough, you start to faint and miscast spells. And at 0, you've got around 10 turns before you instantly die of hunger, regardless of your current health. You've also got kind of a secondary tracker for strength, but it's only relevant in the relatively rare cases when something unnaturally reduces it. Strength itself is an important attribute that affects stuff like damage, hit chance, and hit points per level. Most importantly though, if your strength suddenly drops drastically, you'll likely be immobilized due to being overburdened, and you will need to drop some stuff to be able to move again. Lods of Doom has health, mana, hunger, thirst, and sleep to manage. It almost feels like a survival game now that I think about it. Mana is pretty important in this game, to the point that your chances for survival drop radically once you run out of mana. If you become tired, your mana regeneration rate halves. Once you're very sleepy, you stop regaining mana entirely. Speaking of mana, if you become hungry or thirsty, you can't cast healing spells. I should also mention that casting healing spells uses up resources in your body, making you more hungry and thirsty. It's a vicious loop to manage. This can lead to some sticky situations in dungeons, crypts, and caves where food and water isn't readily available. For example, the Guardian Temple is 5 to 6 areas long, with food and drink being extremely scarce. I was kinda worried that I might not be able to finish it. Resting and sleeping takes time. All of these games have a different take on the passage of time. In Castle of the Winds, each turn advances the time counter, but it's mostly for high score purposes. There aren't any penalties for taking your time, going slow. Each step you take takes between 2 and 3 in-game seconds. Resting and sleeping can take quite a bit longer. I completed part 1 in roughly 9 days and 6 hours, according to the Hall of Fame. You can probably do it much faster if you use more spell healing instead of resting. In Ragnarok, well, the world is ending and you're kinda short on time. You have exactly 22,000 turns until Heimdall warns you to get your ass in gear. At 25,000 turns, he announces that the final battle has begun, and you should probably get to Vigrid ASAP. I remember reading somewhere that going too slow causes the final battle to be more difficult, but I couldn't really confirm that. In some earlier versions, the game automatically ended at 26,000 turns, with the evil gods winning, but apparently that last condition was removed from later versions of the game. In Lods of Doom, you have exactly 9 days to reach the final area of the game and challenge the Black God. The UI tracks the amount of time with a progress bar, which turns blood red if you're taking too long in a given area. I managed to reach the final boss with less than 2 full days remaining, and I was trying to play relatively quickly. You're constantly short on mana, which requires resting for 1 to 4 hours to regain a decent amount. You also get sleepy every so often, which can only be cured by a full 8 hours of sleep. If you know what to do, you can probably complete the game much faster, but I wasted plenty of time just wandering around, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't find any walkthroughs for this game online, so I was planning on writing a full walkthrough myself, until I realized that I was missing some footage here and there and couldn't really confirm some of the stuff that I wanted to include in the walkthrough. I could probably still manage some kind of walkthrough at around 90% accuracy, but I have a feeling that this video will be long enough as it is. It got a bit dicey at times, but I'm glad I managed to complete a full playthrough of Lods of Doom. Overall, I'd say that the game is definitely an interesting piece of history, but not necessarily a game that will blow your mind. It's still worth taking a look though. Now, let's move on to the game that inspired this whole video. Ragnarok, also known as Valhalla, was made by Thomas Boyd and Rob Wavter in 1992. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the game. The game I tried so hard to beat as a kid, but I couldn't understand English, and neither could I understand the game's mechanics, so I never made it out of the starting forest. I started each new game the equivalent of beating my face against the wall, in the stubborn belief that I could make things happen by sheer brute force effort. And while that may have worked for a game like Castle of the Winds, Ragnarok is not that type of game. Oh no. I keep saying Ragnarok, but I'm actually playing Valhalla, the European release version. Valhalla has some differences compared to Ragnarok, like copy protection, sounds, and difficulty selection. Ragnarok was the game I played as a kid though, so I'll keep referring to the game as Ragnarok for the sake of consistency. What is the game about then? I think the wiki sums it up quite nicely. It's the end of the world as we know it, and you may feel fine, but you certainly won't if the evil gods have their way. The good gods are at a disadvantage since they lost all their toys. Time is ticking. Go find some artifacts. In Ragnarok, you have 6 goals or quests. You can accomplish these goals in any order, but you can't really return any of the artifacts without triggering the final battle, so you're kind of forced to hoard them. You don't need to accomplish all the goals. 3 or 4 is usually enough for the forces of good to win the day, so the game gives you a lot of flexibility in this regard. In my playthrough, I managed to achieve all 6 goals with time to spare, although that was with the beginner difficulty. Ultimately though, it's nothing all that complex. The game throws a lot of problems at you, and you resolve most of them in the same way, by punching them in the face. What about combat then? In all of these games, combat is the driving factor. Enemies usually charge straight at you and try to kill you, while getting gradually more dangerous as the game goes on. The simplest case here is, again, Castle of the Winds. You can either attack enemies in melee, by trying to move into their square, or you can blast them with magic from afar. There are no ranged weapons in Castle of the Winds. You can right-click on an enemy to figure out how low their health is. The player and enemies can never attack at the same time, so they have different speeds that affect who gets to hit first. Some enemies can even move several squares and/or attack multiple times per turn. All the enemies end up feeling rather samey though. They rarely do anything special outside of a few ranged attacks. A notable exception here is the thief, who tries to steal your cash, then teleport away. Lods of Doom takes a different approach. Enemy encounters usually occur randomly, but there are a few scripted encounters as well. An enemy encounter takes you into a separate view with you and 1 to 4 enemies, where you both take turns trying to beat each other into a pulp. The enemies behave in an extremely simplified way. Some will try to blast you with magic attacks in the first round of combat, but generally it's just a melee slugfest. Interestingly, you can choose between 5 different melee attacks that do slightly different things, like lowering your hit chance but increasing your damage if successful. I still mainly use the standard and the berserk attacks, because neither of those affected my hit chance. There are no ranged weapons in Lods of Doom either, but you can cast various spells during combat except for healing spells. Combat in Ragnarok is more similar to Castle of the Winds, but you have far more options. You can engage in melee, you can use actual ranged weapons, you can cast spells, or use various powers and abilities. You can also use items, zap enemies with wands, drink potions, and read scrolls in the midst of combat. There's also a button to aid fellow Norsemen, but I couldn't find a use for that one. All of these various options combined give you a great degree of flexibility in how you approach potential encounters. Sometimes the smartest move is to simply teleport away to fight another day. Ragnarok sports a deep and involved bestiary. There are far more enemies that have attacks that do nasty things, like hypnotize, stun, or paralyze you, so ranged combat is often highly recommended. There are also a plethora of enemies that have various tricks up their sleeves that you need to prepare for, like casting spells, turning you into stone, or grabbing and crushing you. You can also turn into them, accidentally and otherwise, like I ended up doing. The best part about Ragnarok for me is the world. Especially as a kid, it was endlessly fascinating to explore the village outskirts and find all sorts of cool stuff and weird creatures, even if I never actually got very far. It's very much the same to this day. Let's talk about the world of the other games first. The world of Castle of the Winds is, as the game itself, quite simple and straightforward. It feels very constrained, and you have very limited options regarding where to go. It's pretty much impossible to get lost. Again, that's probably one of the factors that allowed me to beat the first part as a kid. You're basically either selling and buying stuff in one of 2 villages, or you're fighting monsters in one of 2 dungeons. Those 2 are pretty much your only 2 environments in the game. Traps are relatively common in the dungeons, but they can be disarmed. The environments in Lords of Doom are much more varied. You've got deserts, cities, villages, forests, tombs, volcanoes, caves, all kinds of interesting environments with their own traits. If you're wandering around in the steppes, for example, food will be understandably scarce, but you can at least find pools of water in nearby caves. If you find yourself high up in the air temple, moving off the edge of the walkable area means falling to your doom. Forests usually have an abundance of food available, but the density of trees makes it hard to move about, and so on. Common area features include illusory walls, traps, switch puzzles, hidden chests, and special encounters. The world of Ragnarok feels markedly more vast, and a lot less linear than the other games. Once you emerge from the starting dungeon out into Midgard proper, the game really opens up in all of its terrifying glory. You have 24 unique locations to explore, although some of them are quite hard to reach. The Wasteland, for example, is a realm that hides a powerful artifact, but steadily starts to fill with lava as soon as the player arrives. The crypts are an area with sealed tombs that contain treasures and very dangerous undead enemies, and you will need to crack them open somehow. Mimer's Well contains Heimdall's horn, Gjall, but you will drown down there unless you're able to swim and don't have heavy armor weighing you down. The Realm of Chaos is, well, probably one of the best examples of a level that represents raw primordial chaos that I've ever seen. There's a sense of wonder in exploring the game world, as you can't really tell what kind of new environment is just around the corner. I didn't even get to explore two special areas during my playthrough, Limbo and the Bazaar, although I already know that some areas are better left unexplored. Because, well, maybe we should talk about game difficulty in general. As you can probably guess, Castle of Winds is certainly not the hardest game here. A kid that doesn't speak much English can beat it. The hardest part of the game is getting through the first few levels of the starting dungeon. Once you gain a few levels and get some better equipment, the game gets markedly easier. I found an enchanted suit of studded leather armor relatively early in the game, and the difficulty suddenly dropped noticeably. Once you master the use of the rest button and know when to retreat to the upper floors, you should do okay. With Lords of Doom, the difficulty takes an immediate sharp jump upward. The game doesn't hold your hand. You can easily die several times over in the very first area of the game due to things like having to manage your hunger and thirst while having to constantly fight against the denizens of the steppes without proper equipment. If you don't figure out the correct thing to do soon enough, you can easily starve and die in combat because you're unable to heal. One thing to note is that you can't use minor healing spells or potions if you're too heavily wounded. You'll need to use more potent healing spells, which also use more mana and cause more hunger and thirst. But the game, with easily the most bullshit, is Ragnarok? There's a page in the Ragnarok wiki called Avoiding Insta-Death. That should already tell you something. There are around 45 different ways to reach your untimely demise listed there. There are just so many little things that can trigger all kinds of disaster scenarios. For example, you trigger a trap that sprays you with gas. The gas makes you go momentarily insane. Your character starts going through his or her inventory and starts reading random scrolls. One of them is secretly a scroll of pure evil, which makes the character blind for 500 turns. Oh, and it also transports you to Niflheim, where you instantly die from the freezing, mind-numbing cold. I have a very simple rule for survival in Ragnarok. Don't eat that weird mushroom. It will forcibly empty your stomach and you'll die of starvation within 10 turns. Don't read that unfamiliar scroll. It'll open a gateway and flood the world with monsters. Don't put on that cool looking ring. It will drain your soul into it and leave you a withered husk. Identifying unknown items is so important in Ragnarok. Using, eating, drinking, wielding, or wearing unknown items is one of the leading causes of death in Ragnarok. Many items in Ragnarok start out as unidentified, causing them to have a generic, randomized name, such as Muddy Potion or Ancient Scroll. When you identify an item, its true name and status is revealed. The status can be either regular, blessed, or cursed. Blessed items are superpower versions of their regular counterparts, whereas cursed items can be very hazardous to use. You can also completely wipe out your identity if you read a scroll of identification while drunk on mead, like I did. Some items, such as different kinds of mushrooms and the corpses of various enemies, have to be identified manually, and that's what the wiki is for. Thanks to its non-linear nature, varied locations, vast bestiary, and interesting but dangerous item management, Ragnarok still feels fresh and exciting to play even today. The game hooked me in, and I plowed through it in just a few days, finally managing to cross it off my virtual bucket list. Even though it's largely a monster bash with an elevated level of difficulty, if you can stomach that kind of game, I highly recommend it. It's freeware. Go check it out, I dare you. Even though RPGs and roguelikes from 30 years ago might only be a few megabytes in size, they can still present vast, intricate worlds with lengthy, involved storylines. I was worried that trying to tackle these games would take me months, but thanks to being able to save my progress and the help that various wikis provided, I managed to do what felt like the impossible in only a matter of weeks. Do you remember playing any of these old RPGs? Anything there that I should check out? Let me know in the comments below. Next time, we'll be talking about a couple of aggressive platformers. See you then. Have a nice day.